Everyone, and welcome to week 4 of English 104. We're almost done. It's hard to believe, but we are in the second to last week. So I'm going to go ahead and guide you through our second to last week, where we will focus on rhetorical analysis and rhetorical theory. So as you can see here, this week's focus is on rhetoric, rhetorical situations, and rhetorical analysis. And as I said before, a little bit of rhetorical theory thrown in as well. You might have studied rhetoric before, or you might even be familiar with the term rhetoric or rhetorical situations. For example, a lot of students come into this class letting me know that they've learned about ethos, logos, pathos, logical appeals, and that's a really good start. But I ask you, as always, to keep an open mind because rhetorical theory looks a little different in writing studies, being that it's not always necessarily about arguments and persuasion. It encompasses all writing. Wordle and Downs, we've read excerpts from them before in various slides. Some top scholars in writing studies let us know that a central theoretical lens that writing studies uses to understand writing is rhetorical theory, which helps explain these aspects of writing. How writers' texts are the pieces of writing, readers, and contexts or larger surrounding circumstances interact. How writers come up with what to say in all sorts of genres and discourse communities. And how texts construct knowledge. And what they mean by that is not that texts are merely about reporting knowledge, although true, that's a part of it. But texts actually create knowledge. And it might be helpful to think back to the previous week where we looked at discourse communities, and genres to think about how you can look at genres or the writing from discourse communities to see how goals are achieved, how people interact with those, and ultimately how that drives knowledge forward. The same researchers have several principles here meant to guide you through the initial parts of rhetorical theory. I won't bore you by reading these bullet points word for word because I know you're perfectly capable of doing that. But I did go through and highlight what I thought were some key terms and touch points throughout here that I think would be really helpful to focus on as you start this week. As we've talked about and read about and written about before, meaning depends on context. The same genre in one discourse community could have a completely different either look even or approach or voice or audience in another. Readers and writers also interact to make meaning. Reading is not merely transactional. Even though I might be alone in a room somewhere sitting down and reading a particular text, even though the author is not present there, I've never met them before, maybe they're even dead, but I am still on some level interacting with the writer, and they're interacting with me as the audience, which you'll read about in the first reading this week. Readers and writers interact to actually make new knowledge. I am not merely sort of absorbing things, going back to that transactional example I used before. Although true, that's part of it. But at the same time, I'm making new knowledge based on what I'm reading. I'm subconsciously or sometimes even consciously responding to the audience's ideas and forming new ideas in my head, even if I'm not always aware of it. And good writing and communication are contingent on situation, not universal. Going back to one of those key threshold concepts of this class. You can't have a generic definition of good writing because it depends on so many factors. It might be as broad as saying you don't write a text the same way you write, say, an email to a professor. Or it could be more nuanced, such as a lab report for botany versus engineering. Even if they might have some of the same general principles, what makes a forestry lab report good might not necessarily be exactly what makes a botany lab report good. Why study this? Ultimately, The more knowledge you have about rhetorical situations and rhetorical theory, the more you're able to transfer that knowledge. The more you're able to write from the perspective of someone who has a nuanced understanding of the complex layers of audience and purpose and genre and all those other things, the better writer you'll be, and you'll be able to adapt to every situation, whether it's a new class or an email to your boss or a report in a new workplace, or even something outside of school, like writing the most appropriate breakup letter, which I, of course, hope you never have to do. This image helps to explain the layers of rhetorical situations. This is just a literal snapshot and a tidbit, and you'll be reading about this in much more detail throughout the week. But as you can see here, the text or the actual piece of writing is the literal center of this. And that's the part that encompasses all these different layers of this, whatever they call it, a sexy Venn diagram is what I tend to go for. You have to think about the big elements in here, such as the writer. Who is the writer? What's the subject or the topic? To whom is the writer writing? Who is the audience? And then layered in that, you have exigence, which is why the writer is writing about the subject, which is different from purpose. Purpose is what the writer is seeking from the audience. Another way to think about that is exigence is why the writer writes in the first place. And the purpose is, what do they hope to do by writing that? I'll use the example of this very slideshow. The exigence of me sitting down to make this slideshow was, we have a unit on rhetorical theory. I am teaching this particular topic this week, and therefore I needed to create slides. The purpose is, I hope that this slideshow helps to guide you through this unit and provide some appropriate background information, helps you to think about new terms and questions, and helps to provide larger context to the ideas that we're discussing this week and writing about and reading about. That sounds kind of confusing. It's okay. It is. Exigence and purpose are absolutely related, and you can even see that literally as they intersect here. However, they are distinct, which you will also read about in more detail over the course of this week. Going back to the sexy Venn diagram, you have exigence and purpose and the particular genre. What genre was chosen, either by the circumstances or the writer themselves? What does the audience know about what they're supposed to get out of a genre? For example, how are they supposed to respond to, say, a peer-reviewed research article versus a text message? So as you can see here, the rhetorical situation is not linear, and this graphic here literally helps to illustrate that. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the pale green in the background is context. Who is discussing this? Where and when is this an issue, etc.? That refers to these larger sort of outline factors that influence the way things are read, and also influences the way things are written. So in order to really understand a piece of writing, both as the writer and as the audience, one needs to have a more nuanced and complicated understanding of how the rhetorical situation works. And you can see from my examples I mentioned earlier, like a peer-reviewed article, or which could be just a report of findings, or even a text message that could be extremely informal, like, hey, we're out of milk or whatnot. Rhetorical situations are not always about persuasion. They're not always about strictly argument. Although, on the other hand, I can see someone saying, well, Sarah, isn't that text trying to persuade someone that they should react to the text and get milk, or be sad and in unison with the person who's out of milk? Absolutely. I am in no way suggesting that argument doesn't sort of have the root of a lot of communication, but I'm saying this because I want you to separate this from specifically rhetoric as a commercial or a persuasive essay that's meant to take a position and argue it. It's more complex than that. Here are some guiding questions for you this week to help you think about, where are you starting from? What do I hope you get out of this particular week, and how will it ultimately help you have a more complex understanding of rhetoric and rhetorical situations? But ultimately, how will it make you a stronger writer and reader too? There are several key terms and concepts for this week. As you can see, two of these terms, rhetoric and rhetorical situation, are new. Rhetoric is the study of performance of human interaction in the communication or the products, or in this class, the actual pieces of writing of interaction and communication. And rhetorical situation is looking at all the surrounding factors. And I'll flip back to the previous slides to say, this is the rhetorical situation, all these factors, all these layers, which is why, as you can see here, it's hard to define and you have a pretty brief definition. I also want you to think back to last week's definitions of genres and discourse. These come into play because genres develop over time in response to recurring needs or rhetorical situations. I gave you the example in this definition of me communicating my research findings. Someone way back in the day, probably goes so far back you can't even identify who, came up with the article or the academic research paper. That way, there is a format or a genre that's expected of professors trying to publish their findings. If I do some interesting research and want to share it with my colleagues and get it out to the public, I don't need to sit there scratching my head and being like, should I do an interpretive dance? Should I tweet about it? Although, of course, I'm welcome to do those too, even though I don't. I could. But there's an established genre that fits a particular need that's embedded in a discourse community. And the genre itself shows how the discourse speaks to the rhetorical situation. This is a preview of what you're going to be doing this week. And as always, I'll go back to Canvas and walk you through them in more detail. The first reading is called Rhetorical Situations and Their Constituents by Keith Grant Davey. That reading gives you a much more thorough and complicated discussion of the brief terms of the rhetorical situation that I'm presenting here now. This is a pretty long, complicated reading, so I highly encourage you to take a look at these two videos. These are YouTube links here that guide you through the reading, especially if you're the kind of learner who finds videos really helpful. Once you've read and written about rhetorical situations and explored those ideas, you will do a project where you will look at a particular genre or a piece of writing and assess the rhetorical situation of that genre. Just like last week, we're going to follow the pattern of having a rough draft on which I will give you feedback and help and support, and using that feedback to then create a revised draft of that project. So let's go back to Canvas and take a look at week 4. It's a little bigger. So if you're watching this video, obviously you've seen the slides. Keep in mind, you can always go back to them later and look things up or remind yourself of things. The reading and reading guide here is that reading on rhetorical situations that I've mentioned previously. And I wholeheartedly recommend that in addition to the reading guide, if you find yourself stumbling at all, first of all, I'm absolutely to help people with that as much as possible. But if you want some independent help, I really think these two videos that I linked in the slides will be helpful. I want you to preview the rhetorical analysis assignment early in the week, even though the rough and revised drafts aren't due till later. So this assignment here basically just says, review the slides for additional context and take a look at the instructions for the rough draft. For the previous project you did, I had you choose your own discourse community or a discourse community of your choice. Here, I want you to flip it a little bit and take a look at the genres associated from with our class as a way to do a rhetorical analysis of something that you're already familiar with on some level, being that you've spent the last few weeks in this class. So I give you a few choices of genres you can choose from. You could use the course syllabus as your text, meaning, and I've linked them all here, like our English 104 syllabus. The genre and discourse project assignment guidelines for the week 3 project, essentially the prompt that I wrote. Or the template for the reading guide from week 2, where you did the sponsors of literacy readings. I want to emphasize that you're only choosing one. You're choosing one of those, and you're going to do a rhetorical analysis looking carefully at what is that particular genre's rhetorical situation. I have a little bit about the genre here. This will be a more typical paper or essay, but you're of course welcome to play around with things like subheadings, chunks. Doesn't always need to be those like essay style paragraphs. I know a lot of you mentioned wanting to play around with code meshing, and you have my full blessing to do that. I have additional readings here of what you need to cite, at the bare minimum, the reading for this week. And I highly encourage you, if you wanted to do so, to bring back Dirk, Melzer, or G, or any others, if you think that would help explain your ideas. I also have a workshop here that is optional but highly recommended. So I want to emphasize that this isn't something you have to turn into me, but it will help you move through the steps of this project. So here I have a thing where you make a copy, and I have a place where you can just go through and make notes, and your notes will help build ideas for the particular project. This workshop is meant to help you do a really close reading of the one genre, meaning one of those 3 things that you've chosen. So just keep in mind that that's a resource that I think would be really helpful. Then what you're going to do here is follow the general template or outline of this project to help you write this. So I have some suggestions in the left-hand column for what you'd want to put in the introduction. I have questions and bullet points to help guide you here. So you're going to provide appropriate and relevant background information for your audience. And then for the particular text you chose or genre you chose, you're going to discuss the exigence, the readers, the audience, and the constraints, all of which will make a lot more sense after you've read the Keith Grant Davey reading. Then I have some helpful questions to ponder as you bring everything together and do sort of a mini conclusion there. And as always, you want to have a works cited page in MLA format and appropriate in-text citations throughout your paper. So that's a brief overview of the content this week, as well as the reading and the project that you're going to be doing. Just like last week, we followed the pattern of Wednesday having the rough draft due. You can read all about the specific guidelines for that here. And using my feedback and support on the rough draft to help move you towards the revised draft. As always, please reach out anytime you need anything. I'm happy to answer questions, help people with whatever they need. And keep in mind, I'm always happy to meet one-on-one in Zoom or have a phone call. All right, folks, I hope you have a great week.